Okay, so operant conditioning is um, similar to classical conditioning, and we're going to approach it very similarly to what we did with classical conditioning, kind of getting the background of it and then breaking it down into subsequent parts. So operant conditioning, I want you to think of like when you are, it is the more common, more thought provoking in the sense that it's easier. Examples are easier to come to mind, and one of the big reasons for that is because the learner in this case is not passive. They are a part of what is going on. They are paying attention to the learning process. When we were talking about classical conditioning, everything was happening without the learner's conscious awareness. It was stuff that was just kind of happening to them. But with operant conditioning, your learner is involved in the learning process. So think of training your dog. Your dog is learning how to do this stuff because why? It knows it's going to get attention, or it knows it's going to get some type of treat. So that's what we're going to spend our time talking about today. Um, and we are actually going to start a little bit before the idea of operant conditioning. So we are going to start with what is known as the law of effect. And the law of effect comes from a psychologist by the name of Edward Thorndike. And Edward Thorndike was interested in how animals in the wild learned. How, without, dogs and cats and whatever, we can train them to do stuff. So how is it that animals in the wild learn how to hunt? How do they learn how to forage for the right foods or at what times? And what part of those is not instinct, is something that is learned. So he came up with what is known as the law of effect. And basically, what he did is he would get these cats and he would put them into cages. And inside these cages, there were all these like levers and pulleys, and the only way for the cat to get out was to kind of solve these series of little puzzles. And basically, what he found was that the end result, the way that these cats learned anything, because it's something that was totally new, was simply based off of consequences. And that is what the law of effect is talking about. It is learning based off of consequences. Is also known as instrumental learning, where something happens and learning is based off of the good or the bad that comes from it. um, People learn not to get into fights with other people because when they were a kid they got into a fight and then the other kid punched them back and they realized, hey, this isn't a good idea. I shouldn't do this thing. So that's the law of effect. And basically this is going to be the stepping stone for a gentleman by the name of a gentleman by the name of B.F. Skinner. So B.F. Skinner is going to piggyback on Thorndike's work, and he is going to bring us operant conditioning. Now, operant conditioning had been happening for a long time. This isn't like a new thing that he brought, but he helped us better understand the process. Like we had been training animals and human beings to do stuff with operant conditioning, and B.F. Skinner's just kind of like gonna put a name to it. So he's one of the fathers of behavioral psychology, and he is also a a major influence on this idea of operant conditioning. So most of the time, the way he studied this was with what are known as Skinner boxes. Basically, they were just like what Edward Thorndike did, where he'd put animals in a box, and there'd be switches and pulleys and levers, and this is the way in which he trained them to do whatever it was that he wanted the animals to do. So, just like with classical conditioning, let's go and break down operant conditioning into its subsequent parts. Okay, so we have two ways in which we can influence other people's behaviors when talking about operant conditioning. We have reinforcement and we have punishment, which we'll talk about punishment in a minute. So, reinforcement is when you have a behavior that you want to increase. Okay, you have a behavior that you want someone to continue to do. As a teacher, I might want to reinforce students asking questions. I might want to reinforce students studying for tests and getting good grades. So we have two ways in which we can reinforce behavior. We have positive reinforcement and we have negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement happens when we add something. So I use the plus and minus signs when talking about this stuff because we are adding something. Okay. So positive reinforcement, I am adding something in order to get the person to continue. And specifically, I'm going to add something that is good. Okay. So if I want to reinforce behaviors in my class, I want students to continue to get good grades. A positive reinforcer might be I give them candy. A positive reinforcer, maybe a student is paying attention in class and raising their hand to answer questions. I might say, hey, good job, keep that up. It is adding something additional. It is adding, so I use the plus sign. It is adding something nice. It is adding something good. Okay? So, what I want you to do is I want you to think about in your life some examples of times where positive reinforcement has been used in order to get you to learn something. What are some areas where your parents, teachers, coaches, where do they have you, how do they reinforce your behavior? So write for me two examples of this, and I'll pause the video and write for me two examples. This will be really important later. Okay, we're back. 2 seconds is gone. Okay, so next we have negative reinforcement. Okay, so this is what will oftentimes trip people up, and that's why the plus and minus signs are so good. Okay, so the plus sign, positive reinforcement, we are adding something that is good. So we are adding something that is good. Negative reinforcement is we are taking something away. So we are subtracting something. Now, what type of thing are we going to subtract? We are going to subtract something that is bad or something that we don't like. Maybe I could just do smiley faces. So we are smiling and frowning faces. Yeah, that's much better. We are going to subtract something that they don't like. Okay? So go back to the beginning. What are we trying to do? We are attempting to reinforce a behavior. We want that behavior to continue. We're not going to take away something that they do like. We're going to take away something that they don't like. So, as a teacher, one of the methods that I could use is I have students who are doing really well in my class. They're testing really well. They're paying attention in class. And what Mr. Monk might do is say, hey, listen, y'all have been doing so good, and I want to reinforce this behavior. I want this behavior to continue. So you know what? I'm going to take something away. I'm going to take away something you don't like. So I'll take away homework. You know what? You don't have to do homework in this class, or, this week, there will be no homework. That's taking away something that you don't like. Is that more likely to reinforce that behavior, to get you to continue that behavior? Most likely. That's the idea, is that you take away something, you're taking away something that the person does not like in order to reinforce that behavior. How many times have your parents taken away chores, taken away responsibilities because you've done something good? that is an example of negative reinforcement. Okay, so same thing. Go ahead, write 2 examples down, and I'll pause it here for 2 seconds and then move on to the next one. Okay, so next we have punishment. Okay, so opposite from a reinforcement, punishment, we're obviously trying to get the person to stop doing that thing. So we want a behavior to decrease, we want a behavior to stop. And so once again, we have 2 different ways of making this happen. We have positive punishment and we have negative punishment. Okay, so once again, positive punishment, we are adding something. What are we going to add in this instance? We are adding something. Ooh, Mr. Monk, wrong face. We are adding something bad. Because once again, we are trying to discourage this behavior. So we are going to add something that the person does not like. Okay, so for once again, just use another teacher example. How could Mr. Monk punish someone who hasn't done something right? Let's say that the class did not do well on an assignment or did poorly on a quiz or a test. I could be like, hey, y'all, I don't want you to do this anymore. This is a behavior that I want you to discontinue. So I'm going to give you more homework. I'm adding on something that people don't like. You don't want more homework. And maybe the idea is that because I'm adding something that you don't like, maybe you'll change your behavior and you'll do things differently. Okay, so that is positive punishment. All right, now on the other hand, we have negative punishment. All right, so once again, we are still trying to get rid of this behavior. So what can we do here? We are going to be taking something away, and the thing that we are going to be taking away is something that we like, something good. So in this instance, oftentimes what you'll see how many of you have had your phones taken away. That is a quintessential example of negative punishment. Your parents are pissed off at you, you did something dumb, you didn't get good grades, whatever. So what do they take away? The thing that is most important, your phone. Okay, so that is negative punishment. Positive punishment, negative punishment, once again, we're both trying to stop a certain behavior. Positive punishment, we're adding something we don't like. Spanking, extra running for sports, whatever. And then negative punishment, we are taking something good away. We are taking away your phone. You're taking away your car. We're taking away privileges, stuff like that. Okay, so go ahead, get me 2 examples of both positive punishment and negative punishment in your life, and we'll be good. Good work. Okay, so we're gonna fly through these really quickly. This is just gonna take a minute. So when we are talking about reinforcers, when we are talking about reinforcing a behavior, so we're kind of stepping back away from punishment. We're talking about reinforcement. Okay, we have what is known as primary and secondary reinforcers. Okay, so primary reinforcers, simply put, are reinforcers that are innate. They are reinforcers that we do not have to learn are good. Okay, so things like food, especially food that's high in sugars or high in fats, physical contact, these are things that are innately known to us as good. And so those would be considered primary reinforcers. So how often have you been rewarded for doing something with food? I know, later on in a few years, you guys are going to be moving around and helping your friends move as they go to colleges or wherever. And, one of the big things that you always get, and if you help somebody move and they don't get you this thing, make sure you don't ever be friends with them again, is pizza. So I help someone move, and what's my reward? They're going to buy me pizza for dinner or pizza for lunch or whatever. That's like the staple mover helper thing. So if you ever need help from people moving, just let them know that you're going to buy them pizza and make sure you do so. Okay, that's a primary reinforcer. That is a way of reinforcing behavior. Hey, I need help with this thing, and you are helping me. That is the behavior that I want to continue. So just in case I ever have to move again, you'll know, well, at least I'll get some pizza out of it. That is a primary reinforcer. Now, a secondary reinforcer are things that we have to learn have value. And a quintessential example of this is money. Okay? These are ways in which behavior is reinforced that is something that we have to learn. So for Mr. Monk, as I said, money is is a great example of a secondary reinforcer. Mr. Monk gets paid um, for working as a teacher, so that is a way that the district or the state rewards me for a behavior that they want me to continue. They want me to continue to teach, and so they pay me money in order to reinforce that behavior. Okay. Um, what about you guys? How does the state reinforce you? Grades. Grades are considered a secondary reinforcer. They don't have any inherent value of in and of themselves. They're their own thing, and the only reason they have value is because you give it to them. And, so does the state and other people, but it's just a letter, and this is a way of rewarding, or in a sense, punishing you for your behavior. So that's primary and secondary reinforcers. So piggybacking on this idea of a primary secondary reinforcers, we have a token economy. So this is very specifically dealing with secondary reinforcers. So easy enough. A token economy is a reward system. It is a reward system um, that influences a behavior, but only in a certain area. So it is a reward system that influences behavior, but only in a specific area. So what do I mean by this? So how many of you in elementary school had like Blue Jay bucks or some sort of monetary system for good behavior? A lot of elementary schools will do this, where they will have a system where if you behave well, your teacher will give you money, and that money can then be turned in for snacks or stickers or prizes at the school store. And so what the token economy there is doing is it is rewarding you for certain behaviors, and it is a system that is set up. But the thing with token economies is that, let's say that you were raiding your cupboard and you found like a million Blue Jay bucks that you had lost or whatever, and you found them. You couldn't bring those to Mr. Monk and say, "Hey, look, I found these Blue Jay bucks. Can you give me some candy or something?" Like, it's only good in that specific area, in that specific place. And token economies are like that, where they are good, but they're really only good in that specific area. It's a system. It's a way for an organization to try to reward people and to influence their behavior. Okay, last one. So lastly, we have the Premack Principle. So the Premack Principle is talking about reinforcement. So specifically, the way in which you reinforce something. If you are going to reinforce someone's behavior, you better make sure that they actually want the reward. So the Premack Principle, basically what it's saying is if you give someone a reward and they don't like that reward, well, they're not really going to be interested in they're not going to learn from that thing. How many times in a class have you played a review or trivia game or whatever to get ready for a test? Your team wins, and you're just like, all right, what do I get from this? And the teacher's just like a high five or like a pat on the back. And you're like, what the heck? Why'd I even do this thing? I did the behavior you wanted me to do. I interacted. I've been studying. I've been paying attention. And then as a reward, I didn't get anything? What? That doesn't make any sense. How many times have your parents done this to you where they wanted you to do something, you did it, it took you a lot of effort, and they were just like, good job. And you're like, what the heck? So in the Premack principle, you need to make sure that when you are rewarding someone for something, that you are actually giving them something that they want. Otherwise, they're not going to be incentivized to learn that behavior. They're not going to be incentivized to do that behavior again because they're not really getting anything out of it. Okay, so on Schoology, I will post some practice examples for classical and operant conditioning, and I encourage you to give this a whirl. Try to practice this just to better understand these concepts. So, what you have in front of you here are the directions. So you'll have a bunch of different examples. Of this, and this is what you are going to do. So for each example, decide if the behavior in question is classical or operant conditioning. So the first thing you are going to do is decide, okay, is this here, this one is the one we're working on, is this considered classical conditioning or operant conditioning? So if it is operant conditioning, you are just doing this thing. You are simply telling me, is this positive or negative reinforcement, or is this positive or negative punishment? So if it was something that was if you were reading an example and you're like, oh, that's operant conditioning, you'd write down operant conditioning, and then you would tell me, is it positive reinforcement, is it negative reinforcement, or is it positive punishment or negative punishment? You would just tell me those things. Okay. Now, if it's classical conditioning, we're going to do exactly what you did in the little examples beforehand, where you are writing UCS, UCR, NS, CS, and CR. Okay, and then telling me each of those bits. So for this one, let's just do the one below. Every time someone flushes a toilet in the apartment building, the shower becomes very hot and causes the person to jump back. Over time, the person begins to jump back automatically after hearing the flush, before the water temperature changes. Okay, so just take a second and work that one out for me. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so this is an example of classical conditioning. Okay, and in this one, you have a few things. You have a flushing toilet, apartment building, shower becomes very hot. So the shower becoming really hot is your UCS. Okay, this is the thing that is causing other things to happen. And then the person jumping back is your UCR. This is your response to the shower being turned on. Okay. So that's your UCS, your UCR. The flushing toilet is your NS. It is the thing that, generally speaking, has nothing to do with what's going on, but in this instance is going to be paired together. And if you remember, after this happens multiple times over time, this is happening multiple times. This pairing of the NS and the UCS is known as acquisition, as you all remember. Okay, and so the flushing of the toilet then becomes your CS, and the response of jumping back is your CR. Okay, so you're just going to go through the worksheet doing each and every one of those things, making sure that you're telling me whether it's operant or classical conditioning, and then telling me each of the bits and pieces of it. Okay, if you have any questions, make sure to send me a message on Schoology, and I'll try to help you out as soon as I can. Good luck, guys.